日出了，是不是？
后甲板作业结束了。
我受不了。 日出了，是不是？
Good afternoon and very good morning. Thanks to everyone who is making time to virtually attend Nature Research Section in Pujiang Forum 2020. I'm Xujia, Senior Editor from Nature. This year's Pujiang Forum moves to an online format because we're experiencing the COVID-19 global pandemic. This is a global crisis that has caused 800,000 deaths, and scientists around the world are working together tirelessly to try to find a solution. But this is not the only global crisis our humanity is facing. There is an issue that scientists have been working on for several decades, but its impact is still threatening every single creature on this planet. The issue is climate change, which is considered one of the greatest threats to human rights in the 21st century. Today, we are moving our spotlights on this issue, and we are very happy to have invited 4 experts in this field to discuss the most significant scientific progress in climate change. Before starting, I would like to quickly go over our speakers and guests tonight. I would like to introduce them in the order of their presentation. Our first speaker tonight is Miles Allen. Miles comes from, hi Miles, very welcome. Miles comes from the University of Oxford. He is a professor and head of the Climate Dynamics Group in the Department of Physics. His research focuses on how human and natural influences on climate contribution to climate change, as well as climate change simulation and projection. Our second speaker today is Denise Malzra, who comes from Princeton University. Denise is a professor of environmental engineering and international affairs. She is expert in both air pollution control and climate change mitigation. Very welcome, Denise. And our third speaker tonight is Dabo. Very welcome, Dabo, who comes from Tsinghua University. Dabo is a distinguished professor of climate change economics at Department of Earth System Science. Dabo is an expert in ecological economics, international climate change mitigation policies, and climate change adaptation modeling. We're also very happy to have Jianfeng He, our fourth speaker tonight. He is a professor at Polar Research Institute of China. His research is specifically focused on ocean ecosystem and diversity in the polar region. He is going to share with us some of his very interesting research experience in the polar region. Finally, we have very distinguished guest tonight, Jiansong Zhang, who comes from Xinhua Agency. Jiansong is our observer tonight and will ask questions to our speakers after each of their speakers' talk. Actually, Jiansong and Jianfeng is joining us in this studio, and very welcome, He Laoshi and Zhang Laoshi. Do you want to say hi to our online audience and our speakers?
Hi, 大家好.
Okay, let's move over to our talk
Hello, everyone.
section. The first talk will be given by Miles. He is going to tell us why decarbonizing fossil fuel is important for stopping global warming. Let's very welcome Miles.
Well, hello, I'm Miles Allen from the University of Oxford, and I'm going to talk to you about decarbonizing fossil fuels, or in the subtitle, how we will stop global warming. So this is quite an ambitious topic, because you may think it's quite a counterintuitive idea, the idea of decarbonizing fossil fuels themselves. But this, I argue, is the way we will eventually stop global warming. And to stop global warming, we need to understand what is causing it. This figure from the website globalwarmingindex.org shows contributions to global temperatures over the past 150 or more years. What you can see, the little dots are monthly temperatures over the past 150 years, and you can see they fluctuate up and down a lot with the weather and with phenomena like El Nino, but you can see the background warming trend, and the orange line is the component of that trend that we attribute to human activity. So that's the human-induced warming in orange. And the dark gray is the contribution to that warming that comes from fossil fuels and industrial emissions. And the light gray is other climate drivers like methane and nitrous oxide, and mostly associated with our food production. So as you can see, carbon dioxide is most of the problem, and most of that carbon dioxide arises from fossil fuels and industry. So we need to understand this in order to avoid the idea that every little helps, as David Mackay put it. Of course, every little does help, but it only helps a little. We need to be clear on the numbers here. Lots of people like to talk about the potential of using afforestation, global tree planting, or changing global diet to help reduce global warming. All of these things could affect future temperatures by perhaps around 1/10 of a degree, perhaps 2/10 of a degree for afforestation by the end of this century. Meanwhile, fossil fuel emissions are pushing up global temperatures by 0.2 degrees, 2/10 of a degree per decade. And so that is the main driver of global warming, and we need to stop fossil fuels causing global warming if we're going to solve this problem. And if we manage to stop fossil fuels causing global warming, then we will largely have solved the problem. Everything else becomes much easier. So how are we going to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming? Well, I argue there's only two ways to do it. One is a global ban on fossil fuel extraction and use. I'm sure that's what these anti-capitalist demonstrators would like, but I would like to ask you, can you imagine an effective ban on the extraction and use of fossil fuels applying in every country of the world? I would even argue that it's not even ethical for us today to require future generations not to use their fossil fuels. After all, our own prosperity was built on the use of fossil fuels. So there's only one other way to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming, and that is safe and permanent disposal of all the carbon dioxide generated by our continued use of fossil fuels. This is a picture of a facility in the North Sea where the Norwegians have been doing this for well over 30 years now, injecting carbon dioxide back into the Earth's crust so that it's permanently disposed of and not dumped into the atmosphere. It's an impressive facility. The problem is there's only one of it. There's a few others around the world re-injecting carbon dioxide generated by fossil fuels into the Earth's crust, and together they account for some 40 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. In the meantime, we are emitting 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So they are too small by a factor of 1,000. So how can we get that up? How can we improve the situation so that we are in a position to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming? Well, in scenarios which meet the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, we see a very clear picture emerging. First of all, in the black line, we see the total amount of carbon dioxide we produce from using fossil fuels going down rapidly. but not going down all the way to zero. To stop global warming, we need to reduce the CO2 we emit into the atmosphere to zero. And so the blue line shows the CO2 we emit into the atmosphere, and the gray region is the carbon dioxide we re-inject into the Earth's crust. That's the carbon dioxide we dispose of safely and permanently without dumping it into the atmosphere. I've plotted here only the carbon dioxide that is permanently disposed of back into the Earth's crust. Many people like to talk about temporary disposal of carbon dioxide into trees. You plant a tree, it stores carbon, but it only stores carbon temporarily. When we burn fossil fuels, the carbon dioxide we release is released permanently. So we need a permanent solution. It needs to go back into the Earth's crust where it came from. The right-hand panel shows exactly the same information, but shown as a fraction of the total carbon dioxide we produced, the amount we re-inject underground. You'll notice this fraction goes above 100% because after 2060, in these scenarios, we're actually putting carbon dioxide back into the Earth's crust faster than we are producing it, because we're actually recapturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to correct for the carbon dioxide we've already put there. So we have to get this fraction to 100% to stop global warming, and we have to make it go beyond 100% if we want to reverse global warming and start to clean up the warming we've already caused. So this is very important. It's essential to these scenarios that we increase this fraction of carbon that we sequester to 100% in order to achieve net zero to stop global warming. But why is it not happening? At the moment, as I said, only 1/1000th of the level of CO2 disposal is actually happening around the world. And most of that is actually being done by the industry in order to extract more fossil fuels. So it's not clear how much carbon dioxide is actually being permanently disposed of at all. The reason it's not happening is if you ask yourself, who's the person who benefits most from the successful deployment of this carbon capture and sequestration, so-called CCS development? Well, the answer is the owner of fossil fuel assets. Somebody like this charming, I'm sure, Arab sheikh, who would benefit massively from being able to continue to sell fossil fuels long after 2050, when we have to get atmospheric emissions to zero. So at the moment, we tend to talk about developing these technologies for carbon dioxide disposal as if the taxpayer has to pay for them. But there's a reasonable question to ask: why should the taxpayer pay to develop a technology to allow the owners of fossil fuel assets to continue to make so much money? Even after COVID-19, the fossil fuel industry remains very profitable if you take it as a whole. So here's a simple scenario for how we could get to net zero by 2050. The blue lines are the same sort of scenarios I showed you before. These are the model scenarios from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The light blue are well below 2 degree scenarios. The dark blue are 1.5 degree scenarios. And you can see that in all cases, emissions from energy and industry in the panel A and the left-hand panel come down rapidly in order to limit the amount of carbon dioxide we dump in the atmosphere. The 1.5 degree scenarios reach net zero around mid-century, and the 2 degree scenarios reach net zero before the end of the century. If we see exactly the same scenarios, again, just focusing on the blue lines here, in the middle panel, we can see now that sequestered fraction. That's the fraction of carbon dioxide that we generate by burning fossil fuels, that we re-inject back underground, that we dispose of permanently by capturing it and re-injecting it back into the Earth's crust. And that has to reach 100% as soon in order to reduce energy and industrial process emissions to the atmosphere to zero. And so you can see all the paths follow roughly the same shape. They start from zero, because everybody knows that right now we are not really sequestering anything, and they accelerate rapidly, reaching 100% by the time of net zero CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. And what is really interesting is if we look at the right-hand panel, the right-hand panel in the blue lines shows the global carbon prices. You could think of that as a carbon tax, or as the price of permits in an emission trading scheme. This gives you an indication of the overall cost of climate mitigation policy per ton of carbon dioxide that is still being produced. And you can see that cost rises rapidly. Notice we have a log scale here. This is a logarithmic scale, and we are reaching costs around $1,000 per ton of CO2 at the time at which emissions reach net zero around the middle of this century. So you can compare that with the red lines, which show a very different way of framing climate policy. This is what we call a carbon take-back obligation, in which instead of imposing a global carbon price on the world's consumers and then allowing the impact of that carbon price to trickle back to fossil fuel producers and cause them to start building infrastructure to dispose of carbon dioxide, we actually cut the link and make that a direct requirement on fossil fuel producers. So under a carbon take-back obligation policy, fossil fuel producers would be required to dispose of the carbon dioxide generated by their activities and, crucially, the products they sell. Already, we are seeing fossil fuel producers accepting that one day they will have an obligation to do this. But they're saying we can't really do this on our own. We need all other producers to do the same. And that's fair enough. These fossil fuel producers can do it. They can solve the problem, but they need a regulatory environment that requires them all to act together. So the pink lines show in the middle panel, let's just focus on that one, a requirement that we increase the fraction of carbon that we generate by burning fossil fuels smoothly to 100% by 2050. You can see the red line goes up because we make it a requirement on anyone who digs up and sells fossil fuels to dispose of the carbon dioxide they generate. We don't require a particular level of emissions. So in the left-hand panel, you say, well, maybe you'll carry on using fossil fuels at the current rate, that's the dashed line, or maybe we'll reduce fossil fuel emissions at the same time that we increase the sequestered fraction. Either way, we get to net zero by 2050. But of course, it does make a difference how much carbon dioxide we dump in the atmosphere in the meantime. And that's why if we follow the dashed line consumption curve now, we subsequently have to go beyond 100% past 2050 to take that carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere again. Crucially, if you look at the right-hand panel, you can see that this is a much lower cost policy in the short term than relying on carbon prices to drive fossil carbon dioxide out of the world economy. And the reason for that is very simple. It's much simpler, it's much cheaper to sequester, to get rid of, to dispose of 10% of the carbon dioxide that's involved in the production, that's generated by our continued use of fossil fuels, than it is to impose a carbon price that would drive behavior change that would give the same impact in the long term on global fossil carbon dioxide production. And as we increase the fraction of carbon we sequester, the cost of complying with a carbon take-back obligation clearly rises, but it never rises beyond the lower half of the carbon prices in the typical 1.5 degree scenarios, which have a comparable climate outcome. So this is an affordable policy. It, of course, doesn't come for free. Somebody has to pay for it. And the industry will be, no doubt, passing the cost on of complying with a carbon take-back obligation to consumers, but the cost would not be prohibitive compared to the costs of the cost of reaching net zero with conventional carbon price-based measures. And so this is how it would work. A carbon take-back obligation means that anyone selling fossil fuels has to certify that a rising fraction of the carbon dioxide generated by the production and the use of those fuels has been permanently sequestered, and permanent storage means geological reinjection. We would allow them to find that CO2 from any that would otherwise have ended up in the atmosphere. So companies would, of course, initially capture their own emissions, then they would go to industrial sources, and eventually they would probably end up recapturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The costs of all this would be passed on to the consumer, and even at a pessimistic assumption that we don't manage to reduce the cost of capturing carbon dioxide back from the atmosphere at all over the next 30 years, that would add about 50 pence to the cost of a litre of petrol. That's about 60 US cents per litre to the cost of transport fuels by 2050. Now, that's a lot. That's a big, substantial change in the cost of fossil fuels. If we add on the cost of carbon dioxide disposal, we would undoubtedly make fossil fuels more expensive, and therefore, as a result, consumers would use less of them, but it wouldn't be necessary to ban them. It wouldn't be necessary to actually require consumers to stop using fossil fuels. And crucially, a carbon take-back obligation like this, because it's an intensity target, we're basically specifying the fraction of carbon dioxide that is produced, that is re-injected underground. There's no limit on the amount of carbon dioxide produced. It is likely to be much more acceptable to emerging economies and middle-income countries than absolute limits on their emissions, which have always been a bit of a sticking point in global negotiations. So this is the idea that we are pushing. It's starting to gain some traction now in the UK, and I think it could be a very interesting policy for China to be considering as well, thinking about where this talk is taking place, because it's, as I say, an intensity target and would be an effective way of achieving net zero without having to accept absolute limits on carbon dioxide production, which are always cause concerns in countries that don't want absolute limits that might affect their right to development. So thank you very much for listening, and I do commend this policy to you to think about it.
Thank you, Miles. A very, very interesting talk. And I can't agree with you that fossil fuel burning is one of the most important reasons for driving up atmospheric CO2. And we have to aggressively reduce its emissions. Okay, for the next 5 minutes, we have question sections. And Jinsong, do you have any questions to Miles?
Yes, 是的。
Professor Miles, I have a question. First, I think you mentioned a very unique view, reducing CO2. I think this is a very refreshing idea, but I have a question. In your slides, you mentioned this machine that can inject CO2. I'm very interested in this facility. How can we produce this thing? How can we gather CO2? How can we store CO2, and how can we inject CO2 into the crust? And which part in the crust will this cause some changes to the Earth? This is a very high-tech issue. could we solve this problem?
Well, the industry has already solved it because they are doing this already. What they do is they capture carbon dioxide, ideally from a relatively pure source. So the cheapest places to capture carbon dioxide would be, for example, from a refinery which produces carbon dioxide in a very pure stream, which at the moment is just vented straight in the atmosphere. But the process is you capture the carbon dioxide, you compress it so much that it forms a fluid. I think we all remember from school that at room temperature and pressure, carbon dioxide goes straight from a solid to a gas. That's why we have dry ice. But if you compress it enough, then you can make a liquid which actually behaves very like the hydrocarbons that the carbon dioxide comes from. So you asked about the kind of rock formations we would inject this carbon dioxide into, and it's exactly the kind of rock formations that the oil and gas came out of in the first place. So in fact, the geological community has a lot of experience in finding these kind of rock formations which are very stable, which allow to trap a fluid for millions of years. Because they've been looking for these rock formations for 150 years, because that's where you find oil and gas. So actually the understanding is all there, but what we need to do is work out the policy to make this actually happen, because the reason it's not happened so far is not technical capacity, it's the lack of a market incentive to require people to dispose of carbon dioxide on this kind of scale. You also asked, just to finish, you also asked about capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So I mentioned the first and cheapest way to capture carbon dioxide is from a refinery or a power station where it's concentrated and you just have to purify it and compress it. If you want to recapture carbon dioxide, for example, the carbon dioxide that you generate from an aeroplane, you can't capture that carbon dioxide at the source. You have to recapture it from the atmosphere. That also can be done. There are various ideas out there to do it. They all involve relatively simple chemistry. The challenge is that when the carbon dioxide is very dilute in the atmosphere, it takes a lot of energy to reconcentrate it in order to inject it underground. So it's much cheaper to capture it from source than it is to capture it from the atmosphere. But there are companies already today that will capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and dispose of it underground. And their costs are, in the region of $250 or so per ton of carbon dioxide, which translates into about 50 pence on the cost of a litre of petrol.
Thanks, Miles. I think your answer is we need more determination and more aggressive support from the political side. Let's move over to our second talk, which will be given by Denise. She's going to talk at opportunities to simultaneously address air pollution and climate change. Let's welcome.
It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you today at the Pujiang Innovation Forum 2020. I will talk about some research my group has conducted evaluating opportunities to simultaneously address air pollution and climate change. As I'm sure you know, air pollution has very substantial negative effects on human health. including increased cases of premature death. You can see China here as one of the regions of the world that has experienced the most premature mortality due to air pollution. In addition, China is presently the largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. Starting in about the year 2000, Chinese emissions of carbon dioxide increased extremely rapidly, surpassing the European Union in about 2003, surpassing the United States in about 2006, and now stabilizing for a while and again turning up at present. Top per capita emitters of fossil fuel carbon dioxide are listed here, showing the United States as the largest per capita emitter in the world, peaking around the year 2000 and beginning to decrease. In contrast, China started out very low in the year 2000 and has been increasing since then, surpassing the European Union in per capita emissions and being about 40% higher than global average world emissions. China has a goal to simultaneously address air pollution and greenhouse gas mitigation. Air pollution is a national issue. In 2013, it's estimated that 1.6 million premature mortalities occurred due to air pollution in China. The Chinese government declared a war against air pollution and has been very successful in reducing the concentrations of fine particulate matter, PM 2.5. Those concentrations have been decreased by over 25% between 2012 and 2017. China also recognizes climate change as a global issue and recognizes that it is the world's largest carbon emitter. At the Paris conference, the Chinese committed to peaking carbon emissions by 2030 or sooner. A key question exists though: how can these goals be achieved with maximum co-benefits? Some mechanisms by which air pollution can be controlled require energy, and this increases emissions of carbon dioxide. Others will actually result in decreases in emissions of greenhouse gases. And those are opportunities with co-benefits for both air quality, health, and climate. So we will examine a number of different possible options to reduce air pollution, and we'll examine their synergies and trade-offs with changes in national total carbon dioxide emissions. So what you see here on the y-axis is a % change in premature deaths resulting from reductions in air pollution. And here you can see a % change in national total CO2 equivalent emissions. This equivalent indicates the inclusion of other greenhouse gases like methane. And you can see when there's synergies, you get a decrease in both. And when there's trade-offs, you get a decrease in air pollution and associated premature deaths, but you get an increase in CO2 equivalent emissions. I'll use a figure like this in subsequent slides to show you some calculations we've done on various interventions and their synergies and trade-offs. So the objectives of this talk are first to evaluate opportunities in the residential sector, where small coal stoves are used, in the power sector, which generates electricity, in the transport sector, which is vehicles, including passenger and heavy-duty trucks, and the industry sector, to reduce air pollutant emissions and resulting concentrations of air pollution, to reduce premature mortalities due to air pollution, and to reduce associated greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, we'll also evaluate the benefits for solar PV electricity generation that results from improved air quality. The way we do this type of calculation is first we start with current emissions. We obtain current emissions for China from a collaborative group at Tsinghua University led by Professor Zhang Chang. We then estimate emission reductions that result from particular interventions. So here I'm showing you the potential use of windmills as a substitute for a coal-fired power plant. We then use atmospheric chemistry transport models, air pollution models, to simulate the reduction in air pollution concentrations as a result of this intervention. And then we calculate the improved health and reduction in greenhouse gases and hence climate effects, climate benefits of the intervention we're examining. So the first case that I'll show you is the benefits of improved coal power and partially decarbonized electricity. So we examined the potential of replacing about 10% of coal-fired generation in China with either new coal power plants that displace small, dirty coal power plants with efficient new coal plants that had pollution controls on them. And also, we looked at the possibility of replacing these same dirty coal power plants with a hybrid of 60% renewable energy and 40% coal power. What you can see here is that there's a modest reduction in air pollution and associated national premature deaths, and a small reduction by replacing old power plants with new, more efficient ones in CO2 emissions, and significantly more of a reduction if those power plants, those dirty coal power plants, were replaced with a mixture of renewable energy and coal power, about 60-40. We then looked at industry and with it, what's feasible with existing technology immediately. We found that with an energy efficiency improvement of 10% and air pollutant emissions reduced by 20%, we found that national total CO2 emissions would go down by about 4%, and national total premature deaths would go down by about 3%, a bit more than you would achieve by the single intervention with the existing power sector. There's a lot of interest in using natural gas as an alternative to coal. And since China does not have very much conventional natural gas on its own, there has been an exploration of the use of synthetic natural gas as an alternative to coal. Synthetic natural gas actually takes coal and gasifies it, which requires energy. And so what you see here is if synthetic natural gas replaced coal in the power and industrial sectors, you would actually get a significant increase in CO2 emissions and not very much of a decrease in air pollution associated premature deaths, because the power and industrial sector are fairly efficient and are able to put pollution controls at the end of the pipes, the end of their smokestacks. However, you can see here that the residential sector would get a significant decrease in emissions because the residential sector stoves are so dirty and inefficient that replacing them with synthetic natural gas would decrease emissions of pollutants and not increase the CO2 emissions that much. But you can see here there's a clear trade-off on CO2. If you replace coal with synthetic natural gas, carbon dioxide emissions increase. If instead you replaced coal with conventional natural gas, either obtained within China or imported, you see identical effects on premature deaths, but a decrease in CO2 emissions. And that's because burning the gas is more efficient than burning coal directly. However, what is vastly preferable for air quality improvement is to electrify parts of the economy. Here we're looking at electrification of coal, where it's not just the existing power plants, but an electrification of 30% of vehicles and residential coal stoves, here mainly with coal power, essentially the current grid, 70% coal. An alternative is to electrify more vehicles, half of the vehicles and half the residential coal stoves with coal power. This 70% is a bit lower now. This is representing a few years ago, but the basic idea is you're electrifying with coal. What you can see is by electrifying the vehicle and residential stoves, you can greatly reduce your pollution, your air pollution levels, and your associated premature deaths. But the national total CO2 emissions don't change very much because you're still burning coal. Here you can see that if more of the economy was electrified, so I'm sorry, the same amount of the economy was electrified, 30% of vehicles and 30% of residential coal stoves, but with electricity that is coming only 50% from coal or only 35% from coal. So a large fraction of the electricity that's generated is generated with decarbonized power source, energy source. You can see that you have a substantial decrease in total CO2 emissions of 15 to 25% and a much larger decrease in total premature deaths than you see with any other intervention. And this is because in addition to what you saw at the beginning, where it was just reducing the carbon intensity of existing power plants, this is electrifying a substantial fraction of the economy, here 50% of vehicles and stoves, with largely decarbonized electricity, which gains an enormous benefit for both health and climate. So in addition to air pollution's effect on health, air pollution also attenuates solar radiation before it reaches the surface. And what you can see here looking at China is that in the eastern part of China, much less solar radiation reaches the surface than in the west, and certainly much less than over the Tibetan Plateau. You can see here that due to clouds and pollution, the solar radiation reaching the surface is only about 2 kilowatt hours per square meter per day, whereas in other parts of Western China, it's at least double that, and over Tibet, it's more than triple that. What we found was that just the aerosols, not the clouds, but just the aerosols reduce the solar radiation reaching the surface by about 30% in a good part of eastern China. And our later work found that in addition to the loss of radiation due to the scattering of incoming solar radiation in the column due to the particles in the column, the deposition of air pollution particles on solar panels also reduces solar PV output. So the combination of air pollution and panel soiling can reduce solar PV output in eastern China by more than 50%. So we actually see now a win-win opportunity of increased electrification with renewable energy. The increased use of renewable electricity decreases emissions of air pollutants and greenhouse gases, leading to improvements in public health and in climate. These air quality improvements lead to better public health, but they also lead to increased solar electricity generation efficiency. A virtuous cycle exists here. But I have a caution, and that is that a chemical compound called sulfur hexafluoride is used as an insulator in high voltage electricity transmission. It's the strongest known greenhouse gas, about 36,000 times stronger than carbon dioxide. And it has a lifetime of 3,200 years, 3,200 years, because it's a very stable molecule. What you see here is that atmospheric concentrations are increasing. Here, the units are from 4 to 10 parts per trillion in the atmosphere between 1998 and 2019. For electrification with decarbonized electricity to fully address climate forcing, it is critical to implement substitutes for SF6. Substitutes for SF6 in high voltage electricity transmission exist, but they're slightly more expensive than the use of SF6. So regulations which require the use of alternatives is greatly needed. So in conclusion, it's really important to understand synergies and trade-offs between air pollution and greenhouse gas emission controls. It's quite possible to improve air quality while increasing emissions of greenhouse gases. And so attention on how to reduce air pollutant emissions while reducing greenhouse gas emissions is important. Of the options we've analyzed, electrification of the residential and vehicle sectors with low carbon electricity provides the largest co-benefits for air quality, public health, and greenhouse gas mitigation. Increased efficiency in the industrial sector, we found, is also highly valuable. There's a win-win opportunity. Increased use of renewable energy improves air quality. Cleaner air increases efficiency of solar PV electricity generation. But I do have a caution. Benefits for climate of decarbonized electricity will be reduced if SF6, the strongest known greenhouse gas, is used in transmission systems. Implementation of substitutes is urgently needed. So I'd like to thank 3 of my past group members, Dr. Wei Peng, Dr. Yu Qin, and Dr. Xiao Yuan, Charles Li, my key collaborators at Peking University, at Tsinghua, at UC Berkeley, and at YASA, and my funding sources. If any of you are interested in more details of the work I've presented, you can find the published papers on my website here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Denise. A very illuminating talk. Indeed, there are both synergies and trade-offs between solutions to these two issues. So how to make a co-control of both issues is especially important for the regions like China, because we suffer from not only the air pollution, but also a big CO2 emitter. I believe Zhenzong must have a lot of questions to Denise, because I saw you keep writing during her talk. So any questions for Denise?
Yes, Professor. I have a question. As an ordinary citizen, I care a lot about both the air quality and my own health. But it is a common request to pursue a better life. In our daily lives, we consume a lot of energy. That's a necessity for us. So when it comes to daily life, what kind of suggestions you can give us to address these problems while not affecting our living standards too much? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. It's a common one. People want to know what they can do themselves. And there are things that can be done, like purchasing more efficient appliances, purchasing electric vehicles instead of large internal combustion SUVs, insulating homes if they have control over their own homes, putting in improved windows and things of that nature. But it is really critically important for the government to be involved in these major efforts, because although individuals can make small differences, the world cannot rely on individuals to make these choices in large enough numbers to fully address the problems. And so, for example, some of the work that the Chinese government has done to require the replacement of small residential coal stoves with alternatives like clean coal stoves or air source heat pumps, which are now being widely used in Beijing, are extremely valuable in moving both emissions of air pollutants downwards and emissions of greenhouse gases downwards. And I think the government's role in increasing the use of decarbonized electricity in the electrification efforts that are going on, where increased numbers of electric scooters, electric vehicles, decreased use of coal and residential heating have been really encouraged and stimulated by government policy. And that combined with individual action is really critical to address both problems effectively together. If I could have one moment to just put my talk in context of Professor Miles Allen's talk earlier, he spoke a lot about carbon capture and storage and showed us trajectories of CO2 emissions. I think that there's a connection between what I was discussing and what he was discussing, because decarbonizing the energy supply through either using renewable energy or nuclear power is absolutely critical in order to reduce CO2 emissions. I think that his discussion about carbon capture and storage has a place only after we do everything we can to leave as much fossil fuel in the ground by using decarbonized sources of energy first, and then using CCS for that incremental addition where we cannot decarbonize our use of energy. So for example, some industrial applications which require intense heat might be harder to decarbonize than electricity is, where China is a world leader in the development of renewable electricity and where the costs are coming down dramatically, so that in many cases, solar and wind power now is cheaper than burning coal. And I think that really helps address the global problem of how do we go about reducing CO2 emissions if it's actually cheaper to use decarbonized electricity generated by solar and wind power. We don't need to invest in as much in this extremely expensive, complicated carbon capture and storage opportunity, except in cases where we really need that carbon fuel for the industrial applications. Thanks.
Okay. I think we can discuss further in the panel discussion about the CCS and the green energy system, which is very interesting, I think. Let's move over to the third talk, which will be given by Dabo. Dabo is going to tell us what is the implication of the COVID-19 new normal for global climate change mitigation. Let's very welcome Dabo.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dabo Guan. I'm from the Department of Earth System Science, Tsinghua University. I'm gonna talk about a challenge topic today. I share some thought of mine and on the climate change mitigation and the COVID-19 new normal. Firstly, let me just introduce some observations for the global pandemic and the CO2 emissions, the nexus. So by 24th of August, we already have 23 million confirmed cases for the COVID-19, and there is over 800,000 people death. This is, is from the WHO website, but everybody can access that. And I want to say that we also have a real-time emission monitor or tracker on the global level, on a country level. So that gives you, it's called a carbonmonitor.org.cn, and you can see that compared to the emission from last year, this year the emissions has some gaps. So we have been slowed down of the climate change or emission discharge globally. But whether this is sustainable or whether this emission trend is going to go like that, and it doesn't matter which country, the hardest in the history. This is the World Bank. On the left-hand side is the World Bank statistics. Basic things that we have been suffering the highest synchronization of the national recession since 1970. And the stock market and all the financial market and the economic productions all been suffering. Doesn't matter which country it is. So the government or the public, do we have a time or do we have attention or do we have enough attention to care about the climate change? possibly all the eyes is right on the impacts on the economy, how the COVID-19 impact on the economy. We have done some research, on this topic too. So basically looking at the global supply chain effects in the COVID-19 control measures. We actually have many findings, but the key finding related to this one is that what we are gonna do after the COVID-19, if the COVID-19 become a new normal, how we gonna minimize the economic impact. So if every country is to have effective lockdowns policies, and when they reopen it with a caution, with a go slow approach. So do not open just right after and go slow step by step. Then the global economy gonna shrink roughly about 40% compared to where we were in 2019. But unfortunately, not many countries follow that. But we actually had two scenarios looking what can be the economic impact on that. If every country say, okay, when the pandemic reoccurs, so every country work together, so what we call the recurrent with cooperation, then the global economy is gonna shrink roughly about 50% compared to without cooperation, means it's like what we have now. Every country just acts like what they are from their own perspective, do not consider global supply chains. Then if the pandemic occurred again, then without any cooperation, the economic costs will be about 60%. So really here, what we're saying here is that if the pandemic reoccurs, stricter and shorter lockdown, this is what we call the cooperation, is best for the economy interest, would greatly reduce the overall economic loss by 11%. The COVID-19 is some sort of small scale, can be seen as an example, but in a much smaller scale as a climate change effect to the economy. So I'm showing here is really to see the future, if there's some climate effects like extreme effect, flooding, we have already seen the flooding, droughts, etc., is gonna what's the impact to the economy? So our economy is really fragile, and we need to work together on the cooperation and to do our economy productions and consumptions with the consideration of the climate change. So so after any disaster, if we see the COVID as a disaster, anything after that, there will be a recovery plan. So stimulate a recovery plan. This will we are talking about here. Very recently, the UK government, together with several other European governments, they actually laid a roadmap addressing the climate issues for the post-COVID-19 crisis. So basically, lots of the article advocate that this is possibly the last chance we are gonna have the green growth or the green transition to the the net zero emission societies or the productions. But here, if you, on the left-hand side, the figure shows where the Paris Agreement target is, and what's the 1.5 degrees C and the 2 degrees C target we have, what's the emission would require on that. And the government some researchers made some guess if we have some weak green stimulates. So if we have the money, go for the green industries for weak, moderate, and strong levels, and how they are gonna achieve the 2 degrees C of the Paris Agreement. So this is a very like a scenarios we have looked, but nothing quantitatively. Recently, my team have followed that, or learning from that. We actually put the numbers on that. We have seen what's the COVID would actually do for the global emission reduction. It's possibly is a good one, as from the left side of the figure, we actually seen this COVID. It doesn't matter which lockdown scenario, all the SC here, so complicated. This a different lockdown scenario by different countries. So we can see as a different simulations from our model. And we all have seen a big kind of a U shape here or V shape here, and to say the COVID actually slowed down the economic production and consumption. Therefore, the emission is reduced. But once the lockdown is released, we will go back to where we were. It doesn't matter which scenario we're talking about. So the key question here is that, do we see a long-term structure change, or we are gonna bounce right back after the COVID-19? We also mapping this with the global climate targets with 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C. It also shows, on the left-hand side, especially on the bottom two figures, they basically say, okay, there's some gaps. I can tell you the maximum benefits for the COVID-19 to do with the global climate change is 11 gigatons, which is roughly about roughly a little bit over the annual emission of the Chinese overall emissions. So it's quite good. So that's from the climate change perspective, it's quite good, but it's not sustained. We will go back where we were, and whether there's gonna have a further increase, that is a question mark. Hopefully not, but it's gonna question mark. But what I want to address here is that all the data we present here is only including 79 major economies in the world, without consideration of the least developing countries, especially in the African, Latin American, and the South Asian countries. So these are all the major economies. But actually, the climate change and the COVID, they are all public goods. But the COVID-19, they can't free ride it. I put a typo here. They can't free ride it. So it's no free rider effects. But climate change can free ride, especially for the small countries. Both COVID-19 and climate change, whether they are gonna deal with effectively, is in the hands of the last country or the last actor react on this. So I'm here to try to basically the left side of the figure. It shows that 60 small country. Well, I say small country, like say the developing and the least developing economies. We actually classify the 60 countries into 3 categories. Some countries like Nepal, Cambodia, Mozambique, Zambia, in the last 3-4 years, their economy before the COVID-19, their economy growing on a reasonable pace, but their emission is grow twice faster than their economic growth. But on the category B, which is compare this GDP and then CO2 emission growth rate. On the B, category B means Philippines, Nigeria, Bolivia, Sri Lanka, those countries, their emission growth are much faster than the GDP growth. But comparatively speaking, some of the countries like Ghana and Kazakhstan and those countries, they achieved a relatively faster GDP growth compared to their emission growth. But nevertheless, all these 60 small countries, their emission growth is pretty fast. And for each individual countries, they may not contribute greatly to the global emission, but the 60 countries as a whole, the small economy as a whole, they are actually contributing huge to the, and it puts a great challenge for the future climate change mitigations. So the key point is that over half of the small developing country had a faster growing CO2 emission than the GDP. So this is very alerting. And really, all the Paris agreements, all the agreements we have recently done is among the major countries, China, US, and EU, and Japan, Australia, etc. But we don't please don't forget the corner of the world. Those countries, those small countries, they are growing very fast. They actually determine the future climate change mitigations. So really, how we are gonna solve this issue? So I put three thoughts on the emission mitigation in the post-COVID-19 era. Firstly, data. So that's what we all the scientists, all the academic researchers do. So we actually are quite a number of us across US, China, and Europe. We form emission account data sets called SEEDS, China Emission Account Data Sets. We actually upload or we freely share the energy inventory, CO2 emissions inventory for China, and now we share with other countries nationally, regionally, and the city level. Every year, we host a summer school in Tsinghua, but not this year, but in the past 3 years. We gathered top 100, between 70 to 100 researchers, young, especially junior researchers in the world. Right now, it's mainly from China to actually collect data to contribute to their data, and we have published the menu kind of the menu emission accounts menus and the standard to train them how to use it, and then to cross-sourcing data and for the and a verification process. So one of the application we did is on the city level of the China. Currently, this is the SEEDS dataset. It's freely available on the SEEDS website, and you can use it. You can download it, whatever you do. It's just a simple registration on seeds.net, and you can download all the data we provide there. So that's the first thing is about the data. The second thought is a consumption. I live in the UK, and I enjoy the burgers, hamburgers a lot. But actually, many people now know hamburger is not only bad for your health if you're having it all the time, but it's actually not so good for the environment. Every hamburger contains roughly about 5,000 liters of water, 5 kilograms of the CO2. We require cheap products in the UK, in the US, in Europe, and to sustain our lifestyles, not very healthy and not very sustainable lifestyles. So what we do, so the fashion industry is one of the industry I think the most unsustainable, but they can change. Averagely, consumer bought 60% more clothing in 2014 than in 2000. I'm sure there's lots of girls sitting in the audience and think about your wardrobe and whether you have bought a lot of the garments, how long you kept the garment for. So the statistics shows every consumer on average basis kept each garment half as long compared to the before. So it's caused lots of waste and also the climate change effects. If we talk about the jeans, like denim consumptions, US on average per capita consume 8 pair of jeans or like related products per year. China is 1, India is 0.3. But unfortunately, Chinese and Indian consumers are trying to move or learn westernized to the American lifestyles. So the gap is still huge. But hopefully, we are not gonna go that route. In that perspective, we're gonna have a huge disaster from the environmental perspective. So really, the fast fashion is not sustainable. But how we're gonna do it? We should how we're gonna, educate people on that. We have to make sustainability is fashion. So whenever the fashion industry can make sustainability as a fashion, then we should have a help. We will have a hope for the future sustainable development. So all this brand here in the target, I know some of them like McDonald's, KFC, BMW, but not all the H&M and Zara stuff. but hopefully both people, especially girls here, hopefully you could help to us to change the way of how we can live in green and think about our lifestyle, think about our carbon footprints. So this is the second thought. The final thought only it's communication. How are we gonna touch a little bit about the turn the sustainability as a fashion, but the final one, how are we gonna more engage with the public, possibly through something we care. A couple of years back, we did a beer study. So we really to say climate change drought is gonna cost your beer more expensive. So we took, well, I mean, there's a photo in the New York or Washington, in the metro system. You know, how more CO2 emission would lead to less beer production, save happy hours, take petrol. I think this is the way we need more from every industries, every places in the world to take to let the abstract climate change issue. Climate change is not about weather change. It is about our future, and it's about our lifestyles and how to zoom in such abstract concept to the public. I think that is very important to the future climate change mitigations. So give you an example, then we did a study here and trying to quantify that how the climate change would impact on the beer price and the beer consumptions. US pint of a beer from $3 is gonna change to or increase to $6 per pint. Then so for the beer lovers, everyone, then we possibly need to watch out our lifestyles, our productions, our consumptions on the beer. And on per capita average, Irish and Canada, we possibly on Poland people, we gonna need to watch your beer price is gonna increase huge from 50% to 300% per pint. So this is the thoughts on how we can think, how we could how I can think to communicate better with the public and what the public care about. That's all what I want to say, and thank you very much. And think our consumption, think our footprint, and care our climate change, and hopefully we can turn the sustainability to fashion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the very engaging talk, Dabo. I especially like the 3 points, 3 thoughts you share in the slides. And like Denise said, I do believe every single person, we can make our own contribution to climate change mitigation. And any questions from you, Jiansong, to Dabo?
Yeah. 是的，是的。谢谢关教授啊。
Thank you very much, Professor Guan.
演讲分享了你的一些感想。
I heard your
我就想起一句话，
presentation.
就是现在我们印象最深的绿水
This
青山就
reminded
是青山
me
银
that
山。
green mountains are
那么
actually
有
the
人说
most
现在就是说有
valuable
一个观点认为
assets
现在
to
这个新
us.
冠肺炎疫情
Some people believe
其
that
实是
in
大自
the
然对人类生活方式
era
的一
of
种警示或者是一个报
COVID-19,
复。
this is
那么
actually a
地球
warning
我的确觉得
sign
地
by
球是
the
人类的家园。
environment to
我想
human
请问一下，
beings.
在这个后疫
Earth
情时
is
代，
home to
对我
human
们政
beings.
府
In the
政府间应该
post-COVID-19
怎么样的
era,
加强一些合作，
how
有一些
could
什么样的具体的建
different
议，
governments
使
of
我们
different
不至于
countries
这个
engage in
碳排放又在反
cooperations
弹了，能够
so
保
that
持
we
绿
could
水青山就是金山银山这样的经
mitigate
济和
climate
环保之
change
间的一种平衡。
and strike a balance between economic development and environmental protection?
Right. Okay. I think there's 2 questions here. Firstly, how we are gonna coordinate between the climate change and the COVID-19 mitigations. So that's the first question. Secondly, how we gonna see the long-term climate change to fit into the Chinese ecological civilization development, like say the 青山银山金山银山绿水青山 similar principles. Okay, the first question really is more about short term. How we gonna learn the shock to the economy by triggered by the COVID-19, and how this the climate change is gonna fit into this globalization world. And so the key is that we all need to work together. And actually the fact already kind of teach us that with the cooperation of the COVID-19, such as all the provinces in China working together to control the COVID-19, we actually, China is the first country in the world is actually coming out from the COVID-19 kind of crisis. Comparatively speaking, in all the other world, in the Europe and in the US, they are actually still struggling. The COVID-19, they haven't shown strong global cooperation on that. Therefore, they are quite struggling on that. The same principle apply to the climate change. Its only different thing is that the COVID-19, both COVID-19 and climate change is a public goods. For the character of the public goods is that they actually it's a public goods, everybody can use it. But the difference between the climate change and the COVID is that the climate change can free ride. Some countries who do not reduce their emission, but some other countries they do, so that those countries can free ride it, but COVID-19 can't. So if the climate change can have a same principle, apply the same principle, global cooperation to work on the same principle as the COVID-19, a more cooperative way, then we should solve this problem, quite easily, comparatively quite easily. All the technology can be shared, all the knowledge can be shared, and we find a mechanism to share that. So this is short term. Long-termly, I think the COVID provide a good example for how we're gonna deal with the climate change, and the climate change is Miles Allen and Denise was talking about from different perspective how we're gonna do that. One is the technology, on the other hand is the consumption, and the third part is like method is how we gonna how the scientists, how the government is make a communication to the public. And climate change sounds like a very abstract concept, but actually it's not. It's not only about the weather change, but it actually has some impacts, and then everybody should be concerned about the impact of the climate change, same as the COVID-19. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dabo. Indeed, I think COVID-19 and climate change, they do have a lot of similarities because both issues need global collaboration to solve them. Okay, let's welcome our fourth speaker today, Jianfeng He 老师. Jianfeng is going to take us to the polar region, and he is going to talk about the polar marine ecosystem and the global change. Let's very welcome.
As you all know, climate change has obvious impact on the two poles because the two poles are sources of cold to the world. Now I'll give you a presentation on the relation between climate change and the two poles. I've been to the two poles 13 times. In 2010, with Zhang Jiansong, I went to the North Pole. The China Pole Research Institute is located in the Pudong area, which is the most dynamic area in Shanghai, economically speaking. Now I'll give you my presentation from four aspects. First, what is the marine environment in the pole area? Secondly, how is the pole area changing in the era of climate change? And thirdly, how could we react to that? First, marine environment in the poles. The difference, the feature in the pole area for marine environment is the existence of sea ice. You see, this is the winter of the South Pole. This is the summer of South Pole. This is the winter and the summer of North Pole. You see, in both poles, whether it's summer or winter, there is always presence of sea ice. So the sea ice is closely related to the marine environment in the two poles. This is the whole ecosystem of the South Pole. You see, the creel is at the center of all of it. There's an estimate is that there's 400 million to 600 million tons of creel. You see, the total volume is very big. You see, there's a lot of fish, penguins in the ecosystem. There's also leopard seal. So this is the characteristic to this ecosystem. But you see, creel is also inextricably linked to the sea ice. So sea ice is very important to this ecosystem. This is the creel in the South Pole. I'll give you a short video now to show how the creels are supporting the ecosystem, the whole ecosystem in the South Pole.
And plankton that are at the foundation of the ecosystem. They take in nutrients that can then be used by
So this is the creels in the South Pole. They live in groups, and they will attract other categories of fish to gather around them.
Farther up the food chain.
There are also other animals like seals and birds. So you see in this video, creels, they support the whole ecosystem of the South Pole. This is the blue whale. Blue whale sees a creel, eats creel as its main food. They will eat tons of creel for each meal. So this is the creel, a lot of creel. So this is the mink whale in the Southern Ocean. You see, there's abundant resources like creel, mink whale, blue whale, etc., etc. So very abundant resources, and they're all protected. Now let's look at the North Pole. In the North Pole, the sea ice is more dense. You see, in the North Pole, there is many different organisms. For example, there is a whole chain of food chain. The polar bear will eat the whale, and the whale will eat the fish. The fish will eat the shrimp, etc., etc. So you see in the bottom of the sea ice, next. Okay. At the bottom of the sea ice, there is a lot of ice algae. The ice algae is the primary producer in the Arctic Ocean ecosystem. So the melting of the ice has a bigger effect in the North Pole than its impact in the South Pole. So in the North Pole, there is a large scale of sea ice, and a lot of animals live under the sea ice. I will also give you a short video to see the other end, other face of the sea ice.
In order to film in this frozen landscape, 99% of the work happens before hitting the record button.
You see, on the surface of the ice, you don't see a lot of animals, but under the sea ice, there's abundant animals, all sorts of animals. So this is a key feature to the two poles.
It's like opening the gates to Narnia. From above, we think of it as just this inanimate solid object, but the ice feels alive.
Just like I said before, under the sea ice, there's a lot of small animals that will feed larger animals. So animals would gather under the sea ice. In the North Pole, whether it's the North Pole or South Poles, there are a lot of animals. In the North Pole, there are seals. It's a very small seal, a baby seal, very white, and the narwhal. Narwhal is very characteristic of North Pole. And also white whale and polar bear, characteristic to the North Pole, as you all are all very familiar with. You see the polar bears in the North Pole, they would eat seals. So the melting of sea ice would affect negatively the polar bears. The melting of the sea ice will not only affect small animals, but also affect the habitats of larger animals such as polar bears. So we will feel the effect of the changing climates, for example, the heat, extreme heat in summers. And we will also feel the quick change of the polar environment. Actually, you see the changes in climate. The average climate between 1951 to 1981. So in areas of high altitude, the effect of climate change will be greater than areas of lower altitude. And IPCC has made a modelization to study the change in average surface temperature. Different modelizations will study different climate changes. You see, in the future, the climate rise will be very apparent and obvious. And in the two poles, the climate change will have its greatest effect. And for Arctic sea ice, this is the change trend for Arctic sea ice, and you see a downward trend. This is the downward trend in July. Every 1 decade, the sea ice will reduce by 6.3%. The reduction in sea ice is actually very obvious. Me, together with Zhang Jiansong, the journalist, we went on the fourth expedition in the North Pole. It took place in August 2010. You see, at that time, the whole sea was covered by sea ice, and the width, the depth is 3 to 5 meters. In the North Pole, currently the depth of sea ice would not exceed 2 meters now. So the temperature rise has been very apparent. According to this model simulation, we could estimate that in the middle of this century, to 2085, there will not be any sea ice on the two poles.
How about totally without ice? This is a new issue we need to face. Let's move to the South Pole. Some regions experience higher temperature, but in this area, as the temperature rises, the ice is melting. A model shows that in year 2300, this area, these two seas can be connected. We know that if the ice melts, the sea level will rise a lot. And it comes from West Antarctica instead of East Antarctica. After 2012, sea melting accelerated, ice melting accelerated by 3 times. This is a very concerning phenomenon. We can look at the sea level change. It is changing very fast. In Antarctica,
57.6米这样的一个程度，所以说。
in the South Pole, it affects this region, but also the whole world. Also, you may have heard about this.
因为南极和北极的话，相对来说温度比较低，它海水的这个
and
温度
Antarctic
也比较低，所
have
以
low
说
temperature,
它
the
整个对
seas have
人
low
为排放二氧
temperature,
化的吸收就会比较多，所以说它的
so
生
they
化
absorb a lot of
酸化也
CO2.
是更加的这个明显。那么全球变化到底对生态系统会有什么
What
样的
will
一个
be the
影响？
impact
其实
on
目
the
前的话，就
ecosystem?
是我们可以观察到一些
Currently, we
类似这
can
样的一些现象。
observe
比如说在
some
南极的
phenomena.
话，
For
我们可以
example,
看到
in
这个繁殖地
Antarctica,
本身，繁殖地部分是红颜色的话
the
是
red
减少的，
parts
减少的，然后
mean
是蓝颜色
decrease,
是增加。
blue
由于在南
means
极半岛区域
increase.
的这个
In
升温的这个影
Antarctica,
响，我们可以
as
看到这些繁殖
temperatures
地里边，其
rise,
实大部
in
分都
these
是它的数量
habitats,
是在减少的，或者
so
是它
the
转移到
numbers
了
are
这个更高纬
decreasing,
的这个区域。所以
or
说，
animals are
整个
moving
的
to
这
other
个全球变
regions.
化对南极这个影响，已
So
经影响到了整个
climate
南
change
极的一些最
has
主要的
affected
一些生物群落。
the major
还有比
animals
如说类似于
of Antarctica.
整个的气候变化
And
会导
also,
致南极
climate
的无垠
change
的栖地的增加。我们可以看
will
到这个是
increase
在
ice-free habitats.
整个的这个零下的，特别是幼体，它主要是以冰下的这个冰藻作为一个
You can
食物来
see
源。
that
所以说，在南极半岛地区，
some
整个
of
的海冰
the
的这个减少，
algae
会
is
导致
eaten
它
by
的整个
animals,
的零
but
下的这个分布会更加聚集，它
we know
分
that
布
the
地会
krill
更加聚集。
eats
这样
these
的话，就
algae,
是
but now
会对整
ice
个的
has
这个生态系
disappeared,
统
so
会有一个非
krills
常大的一个
will live in more concentrated areas, and
那么如果
it's
说我
a
们
big
回到
impact
这个北极的话，
on
其
their
实
habitats.
很多
Let's
的研究
now
表
go
明的
back
话，
to
就是
the
整个
Arctic
气候变化会
region.
导致一些亚北极的一些种类，比如说它的鱼
Some
类，因为北极的
subarctic
整个
fish
升温以
will
后，它的种类
experience
可能更
change
继续
as
更
temperatures
适合一
rise.
些亚北极这些种类所迁移到这个南极，
Some
所以说
subarctic
会对整个的生态系统
species will
会有一
move
个非常大
to
的
the
一个
Arctic.
非常大的一个影响。
So there's a big change
那么其实
in
所以说。
the
海水其
climate
实
and
1度升温可以
the
导致整
climate
个的海洋生
system.
态系统的一个非常根
1
本性的
degree
一个改变。
increase will append the
我
marine
们能做什么？
environment.
目
What
前
can
的
we
话，就
do?
是我们在南极和北极的话，其实已经做了一些
In
相应的一些
the
工作。
Arctic and
这
in
里边呢，
Antarctica,
包括
we
了
have
这个整个的
made
这
some
个治理，包括
efforts
了我们的科学
in
研究。
terms of
但是它
governance
有一
and
点，
research.
就是说，它必须要全球
But
的努力，靠1、2
we
个国
need
家是根
global
本做不到的，
efforts.
因为它
1 or
的
2 countries
每个国
alone
家在南极
are
和北
not
极的这个力
enough.
量都是非常的有
Each
限。
country
那
only
么
has
其他的
limited
包括比
presence.
如我们在南极已经
In Antarctica,
成立了一个，sorry，就是罗塞海的海洋保护区是155万平方
we
公里。
have
那么
protected
就是一
the
个保护区，
area.
这是一个国际
It's more
集
than
体治理的方面的一个工
100,000
作。
square
另外的话就
kilometers.
是说
Also,
2018年的话，就
in
是
2018,
北冰洋的5国
5
和
countries
中日韩，
and
然
China,
后是
South Korea,
冰岛
Japan,
和欧盟
and，Iceland
然后
and
建
the
立了一
EU
个有关北冰洋的
signed
一个公海区的一个关
an
系协议，
agreement
就是
about
主要
fishery
是对公海
management
区
in
的这个
the
区域的这个渔业，
Arctic
在没有
Ocean.
完全认识之前来进
So
行
it
相应
means
的
that
这个保
before
护，这
we
也是一
fully
个
understand
集体治理
the
的
fish
一
there,
个
we
新的
need to
一个
protect
举措。
this region. This
另
is
外
a
的话，
new
就是我们可以看到，
effort.
就所有的这个国际合作的话，其实所
International
有的有非常多的
cooperation.
这个项目，像那个
There's
大
a
的
lot
计
of
划，像
projects like
CEAN、
Camp SUS,
BDO，所有的这些
SEAN,
项目其实
DBO.
都是整合所有的南极
All
和
these
北极的考察的这个强国来一起来做的，因
involve
为
the leading
整个的
countries.
这个极地变化实在是太快了，它超过了我们人类的一个预期，所以
The
说
polar regions
只有
change
全
much
球的共
faster
同的努力
than
才可能有更好的
expected.
认识，
So we
也
need
才可
global
能有
efforts
制
to
定更好的
understand
政策
them and make
来
better
保护我们的这
policies
个
to
极地的生态系统，
protect
也
the
也才有可能
ecosystem.
实现我们的极地的生态系统的
Only
一
in
个
this
可
way
持续
we
的一
can
个
have
发
a
展。
sustainable
那么
development
最新
of
的一
the
个
ecosystem.
一个项目就是北极气候的多科学的漂
Now
流
we
研
have
究，这
this
是非常
new
庞大的
thing,
计划，是德国的这个极星号
multidisciplinary
在
drifting
北极区
observatory to
冻结
study
1
the
年
Arctic
来进行北冰洋中
climate.
央区的一个冬季的一个观测，因为冬
So
季
this
的
is a 1
资料
year
基本上是空白，
program
所以说类似
of
于这样的庞
observation
大的项目，
for the
要
winter.
认识
This is a
认识
large
的基地
program
的话，就是需
to
要各国
understand
共
the
同的
polar
努力，
regions.
靠1、2个国家、1、2个
It needs the common efforts of the whole world. One or two countries alone are not enough. I think climate change is not just happening in the polar regions. This is a global issue. We need to work together. The Xuelong ship was enlisted last year. With its presence, we can have a better understanding of the use and the protection of the polar regions. This is Xuelong number 2. It went to the Antarctic this year. Now I want to show a video. This video shows that we hope to make greater contribution to the polar regions. We hope that this ship can help us to understand, protect, and use the polar regions, the Antarctic. So the crew members, I was the chief scientist among the crew. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jianfeng. Thank you for sharing the first-hand data collected in polar region, which is really amazing. And in the next section, we have a very special dialogue between Jianfeng and Jianzong. They are going to talk more about the changes that have taken place in the polar region and how climate has impacted these two regions. And yes, the topic is the impact of climate change on polar region. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. He, for your great talk. Listening to your talk, I feel that we were back in the Arctic in 2010. We went there together in 2010. The trip left me a big impression. At the North Pole, I was a journalist from the Xinhua News Agency, and I wrote an article about the polar region, and I sent several pictures through satellite to Xinhua News Agency. Then a scientist made a phone call to the National Ocean Administration saying that the photo is wrong. I went to the North Pole myself. It's different from what you showed in your photo. What I saw was that the ice was not broken apart, but the polar region's change is greater than expected. I also read a book of yours about the Arctic Ocean. I'm impressed by something you wrote in the book. You mentioned that you feel a lot about returning to the Arctic Ocean. You feel delighted and also concerned. Can you tell us why you are concerned and delighted? In my talk, I already mentioned this. The Arctic changes so fast. There's a lot of climate-related issues. If the sea melts, the polar bears, or like the signatures of the polar region, what will happen to them? Not all of them are impacted, but in some regions, they are more heavily impacted. The Arctic relies on ice, so there will be changes. So I still feel a connection to the older Arctic. So I feel that some animals' existence is threatened. But what delights me is that maybe things just change. Things have to change. And we need to recognize the change with a positive attitude. So that's why I say that I feel delighted and concerned. You also mentioned that temperature is rising fast in the Antarctic. On February 6th, I saw a report about the Argentina station in the Arctic. Antarctic and observed the temperature of 18 degrees. And also in another place, the temperature rose to more than 20 degrees. We also have our long Great Wall station posted in the Antarctica. Did we observe that? That was an extreme temperature. In the Antarctic, temperatures had big fluctuations. Before 2014, temperatures rose, obviously, but over these past few years, temperatures began to go down. Because of the winds, sea ice became more concentrated, so temperature went down. But still, looking forward, the trend is still higher temperature. What you mentioned was very extreme, not common. I also saw on the news that because of the rising temperature, there has been pink snow. What is the pink snow? What does that mean to the animals? So the lower level animals have stronger survival capabilities. So pink snow means algae, snow algae. So we have ice algae and also snow algae. Snow algae is a natural phenomenon, like in Tibet. So in snow there is algae, but if the temperature rises more, we have a greater opportunity to see the algae. It's a normal phenomenon. It's not special. You also mentioned the ice cap in the Antarctica. It's just like a cap that covers the Antarctica and presses it beneath the sea level. At the highest level, at our Kunlun station, the ice cap is over 4,000 meters high. What's the latest research on the ice caps? If they melt, the sea level will rise 60 meters. A lot of countries will be submerged. What is the current situation of ice caps? So currently, ice caps are stable. We see that the average level is 2,000 meters, but a lot of the ice caps are beneath the sea level. Now, this part, submerged part, may be more impacted by rising temperature. They melt from the bottom. If the ice caps melt, if the submerged part melts, this means a lot of uncertainty. Our scientists, do they go there to study that? Now, we have global cooperation in this research. The surface of the ice caps does not melt a lot, but the bottom may melt a lot. In the Antarctic, we feel that it's very far away from us. And several years ago, only scientists could go there, but now things are different. Now, tourism in Antarctica started in the 1960s. It's a mature business. Now, as the living standards of Chinese increase, many people travel to the Antarctica, accounting for 16%. So we are a major source of tourists in the Antarctic. When we go there, what should we pay attention to? As so many people go there, will the environment be affected? They need to follow some requirement when they travel to the Antarctic. They go to the regions with more human activities. They only go to concentrated areas. There are a lot of tourists, but they only go to limited regions. And these regions are already affected by human activities, so the impact on Antarctica is limited. What we need to pay attention to is we need to follow the requirements, we need to follow the itinerary. We shouldn't throw garbage around. We need to maintain distance with the animals to minimize the impact on the environment. Once you go to the Antarctica, you can feel that the Earth is so small and it's our only home and a fragile home. If you can go to the Antarctica, we need to protect its environment. We only need to bring some memories and pictures home.
Dialogue. Thanks, Jian-Song and Jian-Feng. Indeed, Arctic regions have seen greater temperature increases than the rest of the world. So I guess the ecological impact of climate change was much greater in the polar region than the rest of the places. And we need to pay more attention to these very fragile regions and put more energy to protect them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. The next section is the panel discussion. So let's move over to the big screen and yes. Thanks. I actually would like to kick off our panel discussion with some serious, very simple but important questions. So we have 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees climate target. And so these targets are set up to avoid devastating climate impacts. So I'm wondering, do you think these 2 climate targets are still achievable? And where we are now in terms of in terms of achieving these 2 goals, and based on your understanding of the current level of CO2 in the atmosphere and the current rate of CO2 emission, as well as the current process of climate change mitigation, so how likely we are to achieve these 2 goals?
Well, who's going to kick off?
So maybe I'll kick off on that. So right now, if we continue current trajectories, we will completely blow past both 1.5 and 2 degree targets. Right now, if things don't change dramatically in terms of the amounts of greenhouse gases we emit, I think we'll be lucky to stop it and stabilize global temperature with a 3 degree increase. So it's extremely urgent that immediately and going forward for the next few decades that we mobilize all efforts we can to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And that includes from the energy sector for CO2, from methane emissions. It includes, as Dabo Guan was mentioning, from the agricultural and food sector so that we address nitrous oxide emissions. I think we'll take big efforts everywhere from the major emitters that include the US, China, and India, but also, as was mentioned, the smaller countries will require assistance from the more developed world in order to decouple their energy and fossil fuel emissions from their growing economies. It really requires a global, international, coordinated effort supported by individual action everywhere. Or where there's no chance, in my opinion, that we'll achieve 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees.
Can I say something, Shijia?
Yes, please, Dabo.
Right, okay. I think, well, if we talk about short term, if we want to say like the Paris Agreement, whether we're going to achieve Paris Agreement, you know, each country is going to fulfill their commitment of their, you know, national determined emission trajectory whatsoever. Because of the COVID situations, we might be able to achieve it. Just similarly like the Kyoto Protocol in 2012, then we had a global financial crisis in the 2008, 2009. Then it's actually helped the achieve a global agreement, at least in the Europe side. Well, U.S. draw out from the Kyoto Protocol. Similarly, on the Paris Agreement. Now, nevertheless, what I'm saying here is that for the short term, if we talk about the 1.5 or 2 degrees C as a political target or the policy target, possibly we will achieve that, with not mainly because we work really hard on that, but also, something else helped. If you take the positive way of the COVID thing. But the long-termly, I think if we want to achieve that, there's several aspects we're gonna look at. Firstly, is the technologies, and with the gradual industrialization in the poor countries. In the talk, I showed quite a bit about the small countries, where yearly we don't talk about that. Each individual country like Vietnam, Cambodia, Zambia, or those countries, each individually they don't contribute too much about their, to the global emissions, but collectively they are huge. Actually, over the last 3 years of their emission increase, overall as 60 countries as a whole, they actually compromise all the emission effort we have made in the Europe and in other countries. All the emission reduction effort we made. So this is from the things. How are we gonna let them possibly from the technology transfer or technology spillover perspective help them to some sort of leapfrog from the emission intensive industrializations. Second is from the consumption side. Well, we got 1.2 billion Indian, maybe 1.3 now. Another 1.3 billion Chinese. We're actually having a fast developing our lifestyle to the Western, style. And if we can't, if we can't stop that, where the Westernized lifestyle means more emissions, much more emissions, then we possibly doesn't have a great hope for the achieve the 1.5 or 2 degree C target. We can't, in technology, as Miles talked about CCS, there's other technology as well to negative emission growth. That is one of the solutions, but we can't only relying on that. But that is my question. So we have to do both ends. So either from the industrialization or from the consumption side, to minimize the possible emission surge in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, Miles.
Well, I certainly agree that we can't rely on technology, but on a positive side, we can change things remarkably rapidly, and I think the recent history of China has shown that. It's possible within a generation to transform human societies almost beyond recognition. So I think we need to recognize the potential of rapid transformational change, but we also have to recognize the challenge. I mean, but on a hopeful level, I get asked this question a lot, particularly after the IPCC 1.5 degrees report, which I was an author on. We gave lots of talks about it. And I gave one to one of the major oil and gas companies. And of course, I was asked the question, do you personally think there's any chance of us limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees? And I just turned the question around and said, well, if you had to decarbonize your product, if you had to do it as a condition, as a licensing condition of continuing to operate, if you had to dispose of 1 ton of carbon dioxide for every ton generated by the extraction and use of the products you sell in 30 years, which is what it would take to achieve the 1.5 degree goal, would you be able to do it? And the reaction was, would the same rules apply to everybody? First of all, they wanted to check. And I said, okay, fine. The same rules apply to everybody. Then the reaction was, well, of course we would. I mean, if the same rules apply to everybody, then it's remarkable how quickly we can change things. The difficulty we have is everybody is waiting for somebody else to move first. And that's always been the challenge we have in the climate issue. Everybody is waiting for somebody else to deal with the problem. But if we actually together recognize we have to deal with it, then I believe the recent history of China in particular has shown we can deal with these things remarkably quickly.
Can I put your answers in this way? So because the window for us to avoid devastating climate impacts is very, very short now, and the chance is very, very slim. So all the options actually should be on the table and to be considered. And so I'm wondering, do you think that the solutions to the climate change, or the regions that they would like the measures each region they would like to take up, actually it's always case by case, region by region? Do you have any suggestions on, like, what kind of regions probably is more suitable for the solar panel or the wind, or what kind of region is more suitable for electrification, so this kind of things, or which kind of industry is actually more suitable for implementing the CCS? So yes.
So that's probably best one for Dabo, I think.
We can't hear you, Dabo. No voice.
Thanks, Miles. And then I start, and you can follow up. Thank you. Right. We firstly need a global mechanism. Everybody needs to agree on it. We have seen the chaos of the COVID. We have seen. I keep mentioning about COVID. It's actually an example of it's a small scale of climate change effects in the future. We don't see a global coordination on this. Some countries do good jobs, and some countries doesn't. So we need a global mechanisms after this crisis to mitigate, including climate change risks. So that would require, I think Denise and Miles keep mentioning about global corporations, and we need a cooperation mechanism. And down to the regional sort of responsibility, what do they do? I think the small countries, they are the future of the emission giants. All the eyes right now on China and India, because we are the largest emitter in the world. But it's not totally sufficient. We're gonna need to see what's the future giants of the emission contribution. For the small countries, of course, they have a industrialization or economic development job to do, but how to do them in a more sustainable way is not their own job. It's actually the whole other country's job, because climate change is global, global public good. So, and then I very much agree, Miles, that somebody need to take the first job done to promote the low carbon technologies or the net zero. I very much agree on that. But also, politically, it depends who do that actually first. As an example, well, yeah, I don't give an example now, but I leave it here to you, Miles. It's good. It's your area. I do have a lot of hope on the CCS related technologies. But I think it's very, very important to do coordinatively and to avoid the potential barriers, and to promote cooperation on the technology spillovers.
Yeah, well, I very much agree with that. And I think I might answer that point straight away, speaking as I am from the world's longest large-scale carbon polluter, the United Kingdom, which was polluting per head probably for about 100 years before anybody else was. I think it's very clear the primary responsibility for early action lies with those with the largest historical emissions. But I think one thing that the United Kingdom and Europe have not done so well is to think about our climate policies in the lens of how useful would they be to other countries. So in the United Kingdom, for example, we have a Climate Change Act which commits us to net zero by 2050, which is fine. It's a very ambitious goal. But the government aims to achieve this, and everybody discusses this act entirely in terms of how can we do this most cheaply for the United Kingdom, using our own circumstances and the availability of renewable energy and so on around the United Kingdom. And that's fine, but the United Kingdom's emissions is 1 point something percent, I can't remember the exact number. It's not a lot of the globe. So the value of us reducing our own emissions to zero is much less than the value of us demonstrating technology, proving that it works, finding the cases where it doesn't work, that's even more important, and then making that technology available to those emerging economies, those small emitters that are so fast catching up that Davo was talking about. So I think that's something that Europe and the United Kingdom need to think about, not just what is my cheapest policy, but what is my most effective policy as a demonstrator to the rest of the world. So for example, in the United Kingdom, we heavily emphasize offshore wind because we have very good offshore wind resources. Now that's fine, but actually our offshore wind resources are probably better than almost any other country in the world. So that's a mature technology that we can use, and that's fine, but it's not really helping the rest of the world because, you know, our investment in that technology is not necessarily making it cheaper for other people. So I think we need to bring this transferability question much more higher up the agenda when we are comparing climate policies. And of course, the crucial point about carbon capture and storage that I was talking about is that is universal. Anyone using fossil fuels will need that technology by mid-century if we're going to achieve net zero. So I think the United Kingdom in particular, because we have very good resources for carbon dioxide storage, also in the North Sea where the oil and gas came from, we have an overwhelming duty to develop that technology, and I'm embarrassed that we're not doing so. Our government, to be fair, has promised some money towards carbon capture and storage, but of course, like every other country, we are currently in the throes of a post-COVID financial squeeze, and so we will see if that investment survives the squeeze. If I might just argue with one thing that Davo mentioned, which is the lessons to be learned from COVID-19 and the global financial crisis. Those events did help reduce emissions, but I would argue they reduced them in the wrong way because they reduced emissions by people just getting poorer rather than people developing the technologies that we need to get emissions to zero. So I think that's a really important lesson to be learned is there's different ways of reducing emissions, and we need the good ones. We need the sustainable ones, the ones that will get us all the way to zero.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
So I do see actually, so Miles, so talking about, you're proposing the idea of carbon take-back abrogation. I think I do see the two advantage of this new idea, because a lot of people do see the using of fossil fuel as the right to development. So which is also the sticking point of the international climate change negotiation, which you mentioned in your slides. So probably this is one of the solutions we can solve that. And also probably because if the fossil fuel producers, they have to use the CCS, it probably will push up the cost of fossil fuel, which probably will make the green energy more cost competitive. So this is probably the two advantages I've seen about your ideas. But
yes, I mean, I'd actually be interested in Denise's take on this as well, because I mean, it has a lot of advantages, as you say, and you know, I've been pushing this concept, but it has one big disadvantage, which I have to also mention, which is that carbon capture and sequestration is really it's a very focused policy. You only do it to solve climate change, and it's expensive. So it doesn't have lots of co-benefits in the way that the policies that Denise was talking about. So that's one of the reasons why it's not happening, because it's always more attractive to do something else. And I accept that we need to do these other things as well, but my concern is that we are leaving the carbon dioxide disposal. It's always tomorrow's technology, you know, tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. And we aren't developing it now as we should. But there is that tension between the quick wins and the double wins that Denise was talking about, and also the long-term need for carbon dioxide disposal. So I'd be quite interested to know what Denise thinks about that, how we balance the short-term gains and the long-term gains.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. I'm sorry, I lost the audio for a while, but I'm now tuned back in. And I completely agree with you, Miles, that we need to do everything. There's no single solution. There's a whole spectrum of different opportunities that need to be considered. And decarbonizing electricity is an important one. And decarbonizing it with renewable energy, I think, has the largest co-benefits. More than nuclear, which brings in issues of waste disposal and security issues. But I completely agree, we're not going to eliminate fossil fuels quickly, and having a way to continue to use them safely by removing the CO2 and storing it underground is important. But it's technically challenging and it's expensive, as you point out. So it's only one of the solutions. It's not a perfect solution alone either.
Yes, indeed, Denise. I actually have a special question to you. So, you know, China, we not only...
sorry, Pujiang, can I just say...
Yeah. Yes, continue, Double. Yes.
Just get back to the Miles. I think for the co-benefits for the CCS, it depends on how you look at it. It actually have some co-benefits. You know, before you implement, you need a lot of wash. You know, the process. You know, lots of wash. They actually, you have to desulfurize it before you actually do the capture thing. So they have a benefit on that. But from the economic perspective, you know, depending how big, how much the scales we want to have. If it's a big scale, they actually drive this is one of the green economy we're talking about. They can drive the green jobs, they can drive the employment, so many boilers need to be made, and then you actually have a positive productions output on that. So of course the running cost is high, but depending how big the carbon tax is, yeah. So we can, I think this is some co-benefits we can explore there.
No, I agree. I was probably going too far saying the words. Sorry, Denise.
I just wanted to say that with CCS, you have to build a big infrastructure that costs energy, and then you are committed to that infrastructure for the future. And so if it's possible to leave the carbon fuel in the ground, that costs no energy, it's stable, it's there, for millennia. We know that it doesn't move on its own very, very much at all. Whereas with CCS, you build a complex infrastructure, it's a big investment. It means people are going to want to continue to use it going forward. And so I would say the first line should be using decarbonized electricity, and preferably renewable electricity, and only where it's really absolutely necessary to avoid, to continue processes which can't be done with green electricity, should we consider the CCS option. Because the infrastructure is complicated, it's big. You have to pipe the CO2 from place to place. You have to find places where you can put it underground. You have to make sure it stays underground for thousands of years and doesn't just leak back out again. All of these are technically challenging, technically challenging aspects of it. So I think it's important for part of the situation to address part of the CO2 emissions, but it's not a panacea in itself.
Shall we leave the CCS problem aside first? Because I got some questions from the audience. We can talk about more during the question section. I actually have a special question to Denise about how to co-control the air pollution issues and also the climate change mitigation, because in China we have both problems, and we do have made some progress in air pollution control, and at the same time we reduce the CO2. So do you have any suggestions to China, so in the next step, what we should do in terms of the energy system?
Well, I think that China is moving in the right direction. Some work we've done showed how substantial these small coal stoves in residences are contributing to ambient air pollution. And the effort to replace those stoves with air source heat pumps, which can use green electricity, helps reduce both air pollution emissions and CO2 emissions, particularly as the grid greens and decarbonizes. Likewise, electrifying vehicles with green electricity will address the air pollution from the tailpipe from the vehicles, reduce it, and as the grid greens, reduce the emissions from the power sector. Shifting the power sector from coal to decarbonized electricity will further reduce emissions. Improving the energy efficiency of industry will reduce emissions of air pollutants and greenhouse gases. And then there may be a place in industry for continued use of some limited amounts of fossil fuels, which would then require some CCS to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think China's moving in the right direction with increased charging stations, with more electrification, but there's a lot more that needs to be done to ramp up the renewable generation and transmission of renewable energy. And harking back to your first question, where I didn't have a chance to respond, you asked where should the renewables be placed? And that is very much dependent on where the renewable energy exists. So in places that are highly sunny, like Western China, you could have large utility scale solar plants with long distance transmission that would bring the power to the east. Off the coast of Eastern China, where it's very windy, you can have offshore wind, which is close to big demand centers, and you could bring the wind in that way. And from a global perspective, to address the smaller developing countries, the same thing. Many of them are in very sunny areas or in coastal regions where it's windy. Saudi Arabia could become an energy supplier for the world through solar electricity rather than through oil. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. And I completely agree with the other speakers that we can do it. The political commitment to doing it is our biggest obstacle right now. We can start making enormous progress this decade with existing technologies and then gain additional expertise and move more and more to full decarbonization, net zero carbon emissions globally by 2050. And that would go a long way to solving the problem and meeting a 2-degree target if we could have net zero by 2050.
Yes. Yes, I completely agree. So we should put all the options on the table and see which options actually is more suitable for the for each region, and we should have a tailored policy to each region rather than one answer fits all scenarios. So we actually received a lot of questions from the online audience. So I probably will just pick some of them and ask you. And there are one of the questions I find very interesting. So I would like to start this question first. The question is how to distinguish between natural fluctuation of climate change and climate change caused by emissions. How to distinguish their relative contributions?
Well, I could speak to this because this is what I spent the first probably 10 years of my career working on in climate change. It's actually very similar, the methods we use, to the methods we've all been learning about in testing vaccines for coronavirus, for example. It's exactly the same process. You test whether you can explain your data, assuming that in the case of the vaccines, you ask, can I explain my data, assuming that my vaccine doesn't work? And if you find that you can explain your data with assuming the vaccine doesn't work, then you say, okay, the vaccine probably doesn't work, or there's no evidence that the vaccine works. So but of course, if you can't, if you say, oh, no, there's no way I can explain my data without the vaccine working, then you conclude you've got a strong signal and that you then have evidence to deploy the vaccine. And so this method has been used in medicine for decades, many decades, and we do exactly the same thing with climate change. We ask, is it possible to explain the observations we have, assuming that there is no human influence on climate? This may seem a strange thing for a climate scientist to assume, but this is what we do. We say, okay, what if there was no human influence? Could we explain our data? And the answer is we can't at all. It's impossible to explain what is happening in the world as an entirely natural phenomenon. And that's been the case now for 15, 20 years, because natural climate variations, either generated internally by phenomena like El Nino or externally by changing power output of the sun or volcanoes, these have the wrong form, the wrong sign, the wrong type, the wrong time scale to explain the big background trend in warming that we're seeing. So this now is a very mature science, and we certainly have understood how much of the global temperature increase is due to human influence for probably a couple of decades now. And we are now getting much better at understanding how human influence on climate, how greenhouse gas emissions are contributing not just to global temperature, but also to regional temperature changes and to extreme weather events. That's really where the focus has moved now. And that's a more challenging problem because there is more variability on local scales, particularly when we start talking about extreme events like typhoons and hurricanes and so on. But we are making rapid progress in that area.
Okay, Thanks, Miles. Another very interesting question is about the climate change scenarios. So one of the audience asked, do we need to add COVID-19 to climate change scenarios when we use models to predict? Can you see the value of ending a COVID-19 scenario in the future when you do the research? So.
Miles, you want to start, or maybe I start and you can say, because I'm not doing the climate modeling. I'm not a climatic modeling designers. But what I understand for the long term, we will have, for doing the scenarios, there's two types of data, or maybe more. What I understand, maybe two types of data. One is from the observations, like the CO2 concentrations in the air, the observations. There's global sites everywhere. Then if the COVID-19 become a new normal, meaning they're gonna last for a long time, our activities, our economic activities are gonna be limited, then we will need to take that into, and the observation data will take that into considerations. And for the climate models, I think what they would have, they usually based on historical data they have, and to the projections and different type of model parameters. As far as I know, is nobody has made such alert, a kind of modification for the climate models to do that. Possibly everybody will assume once this COVID thing's over, then we will go back to where we were. But actually, it's very much true. One of the things I'd like to add here is that our working mode is going to be significantly changed. I just seen a study from the US. There's about 2,000, 3,000 surveys about people's attitude to work from home after COVID-19. 75% of them prefer to work from home even after the COVID-19. So that would significantly change our work mode. I guess that's into the infrastructures, etc. as well. But I think it's too early to say here.
Well, perhaps I can just add to that. There have been a couple of studies published, quick studies, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on projected future climate scenarios. And they seem to all agree that the direct impact is quite small. So COVID has reduced global emissions, but the amount of reduction is comparable to a couple of years of growth. So sort of, up and then dip and then up, I mean, so it's, what the real question is, how will we build back after COVID? So what will the policies be like that are used to recover? Will they be more investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, which would actually make reducing emissions more difficult in the future? Or will governments take the opportunity of all the stimulus spending that they are doing at the moment to really push a green recovery agenda? So that's the real question, and we don't know that yet. Some governments are saying that they want to do a green recovery, but we haven't seen yet how the money will be spent. So that's the real test. One interesting aspect, which I guess also Denise would talk to, is COVID has taught us a lot about air quality. So yeah. I think that and the potential for improving air quality, which of course is one of the key co-benefits of climate action. On what Dabo mentioned about working practices, I just want to mention, of course, academics will have to look at our own working practices as we transition to a net zero world. And in fact, we published a paper just a couple of weeks ago. Milan Klauer, a colleague here in Oxford, was the lead author. It was a paper in Nature on the climate impact of international conferences. And we looked at, Milan did most of the work on this. We looked at the impact of an American Geophysical Union conference and where all the carbon was spent with people getting to and from the conference. And it was, total of some journeys to the sun. I can't remember the exact number, but it was amazing the total amount of travel involved in just going to one international conference like the American Geophysical Union. So I think we as academics will have to think about this. And maybe forums like the 2020 Pujiang Innovation Forum will actually become more of a model for the future. And we will all have to learn about how to do this.
Indeed. Thank you for your answering. Finally, because we have...
I think Xujia wouldn't like us to work from home very much, because the editors, I heard a number of Nature editors says they double or triple their workload since the lockdown.
Indeed.
Because the number of
manuscripts. Very energy efficient. very energy efficient to have conferences this way, and easier for people to attend.
Yes, indeed. I have the last question for Denise, which is about SF6 coming from the audience. So they ask, are there any substitutes now to SF6? So you mentioned SF6, which is very
so that's something that's come to my attention only recently, and I do understand there are some substitutes. Industry in the US has been reluctant to use them because they're expensive. SF6 is used in high voltage and medium voltage transmission systems. And so it's worth looking into the substitutes. I can't tell you right now exactly what they are, but I understand that they're not prohibitively expensive. They're just slightly more expensive. If I could have a moment also just to comment on the earlier discussion, one thing that crossed my mind about Dabo's concern, which is correct, about increasing emissions from smaller developing countries, is that how international finance works will have a big effect on what those countries build. And right now, China's development finance is the only remaining international development finance that's funding coal power plants around the world. So if China were to, like South Korea and Japan has recently done, decide to no longer fund coal power around the world, it would have a big effect on what developing countries will build in the future and what their ultimate CO2 emission trajectories look like. So there's real opportunities, I think, for cooperation between the wealthier and less wealthier countries of the world to really influence the future trajectories, the future emission trajectories of developing countries.
Okay. I really like our discussions, but due to the time strain, it's already almost 10 p.m. in China, so we have to stop now. And thank you very much to join us, and thank you for your discussion and talks, which are very illuminating and interesting. And thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you for the questions.
Yes.
Really enjoyed this.
Yes. I think after all the discussion and the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye. I think after all the discussions and talks, the message for us is very, very clear. While we have a lot of options on the table, the windows or the opportunities for us to avoid the devastating climate change impacts is becoming smaller and smaller. So let's hope that not only the scientists around the world can work together, but all the stakeholders can work together to protect our planet and save our planet. I do hope you enjoy the 2020 Pujiang Innovation Forum. Have a good night.